Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a moment in every relationship, every bond, every connection, where silence becomes louder than words, distance feels heavier than mountains, and the absence of communication becomes a battlefield of assumptions, pain, and emotional chaos. But what if I told you that this very silence, this space between two people, is not the end, but a powerful doorway to transformation? When a man and a woman do not contact each other, it is not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it is a test, sometimes a wake-up call, and sometimes the beginning of a new, stronger version of themselves. Because in the absence of words, truth finally has room to speak. Today, I want to take you on a journey into understanding what this silence really means and how you can transform into power, clarity, and growth. When communication stops, the mind begins to search for truth. Without daily conversations, you start to see whether the relationship was built on genuine connection or habit. Silence exposes your real feelings, your real priorities, and your real fears. It forces both sides to confront what they've been avoiding. Stepping back from someone doesn't always push you away. It sometimes helps you see everything more clearly. When emotions cool and reactions settle, people finally understand what truly matters, what was hurting them and what was healing them. Distance becomes a mirror reflecting who you are and what you value. Two people not talking doesn't mean they're not growing. In fact, this gap often becomes the birthplace of strength. In silence, you learn emotional independence, self-respect, boundaries, and clarity. You grow into someone who no longer begs for attention, but attracts connection through self-worth. Talking every day means nothing if the conversations have no honesty, no vulnerability, no purpose. Sometimes silence becomes necessary so that when communication returns, it comes back with meaning. The pause creates a reset, an opportunity to rebuild with truth instead of pretending. People communicate even when they're silent. A lack of effort is a form of effort. A lack of communication is communication. When someone stops reaching out, it reveals priorities. When two people stop reaching out, it reveals a crossroads. Either they are drifting apart or preparing for a stronger return. Sometimes two people need to lose each other temporarily to value each other fully. Distance can reignite appreciation. Silence can spark realization. And absence can remind them that connection is a privilege, not a guarantee. The comeback after silence, if both choose it, can be the strongest chapter of all. Ladies and gentlemen, silence is not the enemy. It is a teacher. It is a test. It is a transformation. When a man and a woman do not contact each other, the universe is giving them space to decide, will you grow? Will you awaken? Will you choose clarity over confusion? Will you rise stronger than before? Because the truth is simple. Silence either breaks you or it builds you. Let it build you. Silence reveals what noise hides, because when two people stop communicating, every distraction, every habitual routine, and every emotional shortcut suddenly disappears. In the absence of constant messages, calls, or conversations, the mind is left alone with its raw, unfiltered truth. Noise, whether it's the noise of daily life, the noise of arguments, or the noise of forced interaction, often covers up the deeper realities within a relationship. People get so used to responding automatically, keeping the peace, or glossing over uncomfortable moments that they forget to ask themselves what they truly feel. But silence removes the mask. It removes the quick replies, the performative affection, the defensive reactions, and the emotional shortcuts. What's left is the actual state of the connection. When communication stops, both individuals begin to see things more clearly because there is no longer a constant flow of words to distract them. The absence creates a powerful pause, and in that pause, every suppressed feeling rises to the surface. You start seeing whether you were genuinely happy or simply comfortable, whether you loved the person or just feared losing them, whether your bond was built on true connection or on routine. Silence forces honesty, sometimes brutally, because it creates an environment where you can no longer pretend. Without someone else's words influencing your thoughts, your own inner voice becomes louder, and it starts asking difficult questions that the noise previously drowned out. Silence can highlight the emotional imbalances you ignored. Maybe you realize you were giving too much while receiving too little. Maybe you see how dependent you've become on their attention. Maybe you understand that you were tolerating behavior you should have confronted. Sometimes silence reveals the uncomfortable truth that the relationship was already fragile, and the communication you thought was connection was actually a lifeline you were desperately holding on to. Other times, silence shows you just how deeply you care, because the quiet creates a longing that words could never measure. It can reveal commitment, loyalty, attachment, or pain that was hidden beneath the routine exchanges. In silence, insecurities also surface. Without replies to reassure you, your mind begins to create stories, some rooted in fear, some in memory, some in possibility. You notice how much power you gave to their responses. You realize how often you relied on their presence to regulate your emotions. Silence exposes your emotional dependence, showing you where you need healing and where you need boundaries. It forces you to confront the parts of yourself that you avoid facing when the relationship is active and noisy. But silence does more than reveal emotional truth. It exposes behavioral patterns too. You start to see whether you only reached out of habit or out of love. You notice if you were chasing validation or genuinely nurturing a connection. You become aware of how much effort you were putting in compared to what you were receiving. And on the other side, the silence from the other person tells its own story. If they do not reach out, it reveals their priorities. If they reach out after time passes, it shows a different truth. Silence becomes a test not of love, but of intention. Ultimately, silence removes the illusions. It strips away the temporary comfort that noise provides. It sheds light on what the relationship really is and what it has the potential to become. It forces emotional honesty and makes you confront your own truths without hiding behind conversations, routines, or excuses. It reveals the unfiltered state of the bond, showing you everything that daily communication kept covered, giving both people a chance to see reality without distortion. Distance creates perspective because when two people step away from each other, physically, emotionally, or through silence, the mind finally gets the room it needs to think clearly. When you are constantly connected to someone, your emotions stay stirred, your judgments get clouded, and even small interactions can trigger reactions instead of reflection. But when distance enters the picture, the emotional fog slowly starts to lift. You begin to look at the relationship with fresh eyes instead of reacting from habit or impulse. What felt urgent, dramatic, or overwhelming starts to settle. What once consumed your thoughts begins to make more sense. You are no longer influenced by the tone of their voice, the timing of their replies, or the weight of their presence. Distance allows your emotions to breathe, and when emotions breathe, the mind awakens. In the quiet that distance brings, understanding becomes sharper. You start recognizing patterns you overlooked before. You see what was hurting you, what was strengthening you, what was draining you, and what was healing you. Sometimes you realize that the closeness you once craved was actually suffocating you. Other times you understand that the relationship meant more to you than you acknowledged. Distance has an interesting way of showing you what really matters versus what only felt important in the heat of the moment. It helps separate temporary feelings from real truth. It reveals the difference between attachment and genuine love, between fear of losing someone and the desire to grow with them. When you step back, you also begin to see yourself more clearly. You recognize your own behaviors, your emotional triggers, your unmet needs, and the expectations you placed on the other person. You start seeing your flaws without judgment and your strengths without exaggeration. This self-awareness is something that closeness often blocks because you're too busy responding to the other person to actually observe yourself. Distance shifts the focus inward. It helps you understand why certain things affected you so deeply and why others didn't bother you at all. It allows you to see what you brought into the relationship, both the good and the painful, and what you want to change moving forward. Perspective also emerges when you are no longer reacting to someone's presence. You can think about the relationship without being influenced by their current mood, behavior, or actions. You begin to see the whole story instead of just the chapter you were emotionally stuck in. You can finally ask yourself questions that closeness didn't allow. Were we truly compatible, or were we forcing something that no longer fit? Was I communicating or simply venting? Was I listening or just defending? Did I stay because I was growing or because I was afraid to leave? Distance helps you answer these questions with honesty because there is no emotional pressure pushing you toward a particular conclusion. One of the most powerful things distance teaches is how much of your happiness depended on the other person. It reveals whether their presence was enhancing your life or consuming it. It shows whether you were emotionally balanced or emotionally dependent. If the space brings you peace, it is a sign. If it brings you clarity, it is a sign. If it brings you longing, that too is a sign. Every feeling that rises in distance holds a message you couldn't hear when you were too close. Distance also gives the other person space to reflect. They too begin to understand what they miss, what they don't miss, what they regret, and what they want. In that space, truths that were buried under routine or conflict finally surface. The emotional grip loosens and both individuals can see each other not through the lens of stress or expectation, but through reality. In the end, distance doesn't always push people apart. More often, it reveals the value of what they had or the freedom they needed. It creates room for perspective that closeness rarely provides. And that perspective becomes the compass that guides what comes next. Growth happens in the space between two people because silence and distance create an environment where emotional development, self-awareness, and inner strength have room to expand. When contact stops, the mind is no longer consumed with how to respond, what to say, how to fix things, or how to maintain the connection. Instead, you finally have the freedom to focus on yourself. This shift is powerful because constant communication can create emotional dependency, routine-based attachment, or even an unconscious fear of being alone. But when distance arrives, you become aware of how much you were relying on the other person to fill your emotional gaps. That awareness becomes the foundation of growth. You begin to notice the areas where you gave too much, the areas where you accepted too little, and the boundaries you never enforced. Distance becomes the teacher that closeness never allowed. In silence, you gain the ability to observe your emotions without reacting to them. Instead of responding to someone's words or actions, you start responding to your own inner signals. You see which feelings are rooted in fear, insecurity, or old wounds, and which feelings come from genuine love or meaningful connection. Many people don't realize how much their emotional state is influenced by another person's presence until that person is gone. It creates a space where you can heal from emotional patterns you didn't know existed. Patterns like overthinking, overgiving, people-pleasing, or seeking validation through another person's attention. Growth emerges because silence forces you to break the cycle. The space between two people also teaches resilience. When communication ends, the emotional discomfort can feel overwhelming at first. There may be anxiety, longing, frustration, or confusion. But as time passes, you begin to develop the emotional muscles you didn't know you needed. You learn how to soothe yourself instead of depending on someone's reassurance. You learn how to find peace in solitude instead of fearing it. You learn how to stand emotionally strong, even when your heart feels unsteady. This resilience becomes a core part of who you are, and it stays with you long after the silence ends. The growth doesn't only happen internally. Distance helps you understand what you truly want from the relationship. When you are too close, emotions cloud judgment. You may tolerate things that hurt you, ignore red flags, or settle for connections that don't align with your worth. But in silence, clarity begins to form. You can evaluate the bond from a rational perspective rather than an emotional one. You may realize that you were compromising too much of yourself or that you were sacrificing your peace to maintain a relationship that wasn't fulfilling you. On the other hand, you may discover that the connection meant more to you than you admitted and that the space is revealing its true value. Either way, growth occurs because you're seeing the relationship without emotional distortion. It's not only personal growth, it's relational growth too. When two people step back, they begin to understand each other better. The absence gives both sides a chance to reflect on what went wrong, what was misunderstood, what was unspoken, and what needs to change. Sometimes the space heals wounds that conversations only made deeper. Without the pressure to respond, blame, or defend, both individuals can finally understand the other person's perspective. They can acknowledge mistakes, see their own shortcomings, and recognize the emotional effort the other person was giving. This reflection becomes the seed of growth that wasn't possible in the middle of conflict or emotional turmoil. Growth also happens because the silence challenges your identity. You begin to rediscover who you are outside of the relationship. You reconnect with parts of yourself that were lost or overshadowed. You find passions, goals, and strengths that were buried beneath the emotional noise. This self-reconnection is one of the deepest forms of growth because it builds a stronger version of you, one that doesn't disappear in relationships but evolves through them. The space between two people, no matter how uncomfortable, becomes a transformative environment where healing, clarity, strength, and emotional maturity take root, shaping you into someone who is not only more aware but more powerful within yourself. Communication without clarity is just noise because when two people talk without understanding each other's true intentions, emotions, or needs, the conversation becomes an endless loop of words that lead nowhere. Many relationships rely on constant messaging, frequent calls, or long discussions, but quantity doesn't equal connection. When the meaning behind the words is missing, the communication becomes an emotional distraction rather than a solution. People talk to feel closer, to avoid discomfort, or to maintain the illusion that everything is fine, but without clarity, those conversations become like static on a radio, sound without direction. The truth is that you can speak every day and still be disconnected. You can talk for hours and still misunderstand each other. You can communicate frequently yet fail to communicate deeply. Clarity is the foundation of meaningful connection, and without it, all the noise becomes a barrier to real understanding. When a man and woman stop contacting each other, this pause often exposes how much of their previous communication was unclear, unresolved, or emotionally shallow. Silence forces them to look back and recognize how many of their conversations were driven by fear rather than truth. Maybe they spoke to avoid losing each other instead of addressing what was breaking them. Maybe they apologized without understanding the real issue. Maybe they discussed everything except the things that truly mattered: boundaries, expectations, needs, emotion, fears. In the absence of communication, they finally begin to see how their words lacked intention. And that recognition becomes the first step toward real clarity. Clarity requires vulnerability, and many people avoid vulnerability because it demands honesty about feelings they barely understand themselves. So instead of expressing real emotions, hurt, insecurity, disappointment, desire, they hide behind vague statements, half answers, or surface level conversations. But this avoidance builds emotional distance even when they are talking every day. True communication means sharing what's real, not what's comfortable. When clarity is missing, arguments repeat, misunderstandings multiply, and emotional distance grows silently beneath the noise. Two people can be talking but not connecting, speaking but not understanding, replying but not resolving. The silence that comes when they stop contacting each other becomes a mirror. It reflects the truth that conversation alone doesn't fix anything. If anything, too much unclear communication can make things worse by creating emotional confusion. Without clarity, each person interprets words based on their fears, assumptions, and past experiences. One person may think they are expressing love while the other hears pressure. One may think they are being honest while the other hears criticism. One may believe they are connecting while the other feels unheard. Noise fills the space where clarity should exist. Distance helps both people realize that communication is not about speaking, it's about understanding. It's about listening with the intention to learn, not defend. It's about expressing emotions with honesty, not manipulation. It's about asking questions that matter rather than staying silent out of fear. When two people stop communicating, they begin to notice how much they misunderstood each other before. They start to reflect on what they truly needed but never said, what they wanted but were too afraid to express, and what they tolerated because they didn't know how to communicate boundaries clearly. Clarity also requires emotional maturity. It means being able to say, this is what I feel, without blaming the other person. It means being able to hear feedback without taking it as an attack. It means recognizing your triggers and communicating them responsibly. Many relationships fail not because the communication stops, because the communication was unclear from the beginning. Silence exposes this. It shows where assumptions replaced honesty, where fear replaced vulnerability, where routine replaced intention. And in this realization, both individuals have the chance to return with clearer minds and clearer hearts. Communication without clarity is just noise, because words lose their power when they lack truth, direction, and emotional transparency. Silence becomes a reminder that real connection isn't built on how much you talk, but on how deeply you understand each other when you choose to speak again. People communicate even when they're silent because every action, every pause, and every absence carries meaning. When a man and a woman stop contacting each other, that silence becomes a message in itself, a message that often speaks louder than words. Communication is not limited to spoken language. It happens through behavior, through effort, through presence, and through the lack of it. When someone chooses not to reach out, it reveals something about their emotional state, their priorities, and their intentions. Silence is never empty. It is filled with hidden signals waiting to be understood. Sometimes it means someone needs space to think. Sometimes it means they're hurting. Sometimes it means they've lost interest. And sometimes it's a test to see who will make the next move. The absence of communication creates a shift that forces both individuals to pay attention in a way they never did when the conversations were constant. When two people stop contacting each other every hour, every day, every moment becomes a form of emotional information. Silence can show you who is willing to fight for the connection and who is comfortable letting it fade. If one person cares deeply, silence becomes painful, and that pain often pushes them to reflect on the relationship. If the other person feels indifferent, silence becomes natural and effortless. The contrast reveals truths that words may have hidden. You begin to see the difference between someone who was attached out of habit and someone who was connected through emotion. The passive language of silence often uncovers what spoken language was trying to hide. Silence also reveals priorities. When communication stops, both individuals instinctively decide whether the relationship is worth saving. If someone truly values the bond, the absence will feel heavy and they will feel the pull to reconnect. Their actions or lack of action become the message. Effort is communication. Initiative is communication. The refusal to let the silence grow is communication. At the same time, the willingness to let days pass without reaching out also communicates something. It shows emotional distance, unresolved frustration, or a lack of desire to continue investing. This lack of communication also reveals emotional maturity. Some people use silence as a weapon, hoping to create guilt or insecurity. Others use silence as a shield because they fear confrontation, vulnerability, or rejection. And some use silence as a pathway toward clarity, needing time to process emotions before re-engaging. Each type of silence carries its own meaning, and understanding the motivation behind it becomes essential. Silence without intention creates confusion. Silence with intention creates revelation. In either case, the message is there, even if it is unspoken. Another layer of meaning in silence is the emotional response it triggers. How you react to the lack of communication says a great deal about your attachment style, your fears, your expectations, and your boundaries. If the silence makes you anxious, it may highlight deeper insecurities or past trauma. If the silence brings relief, it may signal that you are overwhelmed or unhappy in the connection. If the silence motivates you to reflect instead of react, it shows emotional growth. The way you interpret and handle silence becomes its own form of internal communication, showing you what you need to heal and what you desire in a relationship. The silence between two people can also reveal compatibility. Some relationships survive only through constant contact. Once the communication stops, the connection dissolves because there was no real foundation. Other relationships become stronger after silence because both individuals realize they miss each other in ways that matter. Silence becomes a filter that separates emotional neediness from genuine love, temporary attachment from lasting connection. In that distance, people learn whether they were holding on to the relationship out of fear of being alone or out of true emotional alignment. Silence is also a message of boundaries. Sometimes people withdraw because they feel disrespected, unheard, or overwhelmed. Their silence becomes a way of saying, I can't continue like this, even if the words were never spoken. The pause becomes a signal that something wasn't working. Silence can express disappointment, protect dignity, or preserve emotional energy. And when the other person notices that silence and reflects on it, growth becomes possible. Not contacting each other is rarely a neutral act. It conveys feelings, intentions, conflicts, and choices in ways that spoken conversations often avoid. Silence becomes a powerful mirror, reflecting the true state of the relationship and providing insight into emotions that words were too weak or too confusing to express. Silence can be the catalyst for a powerful comeback, because when two people stop communicating, the emotional landscape shifts in a way that forces clarity, accountability, and rediscovery. In the quiet space where words no longer flow and attention no longer feels constant, the heart begins to realize what it truly values. The absence of someone creates a contrast that reveals their importance. When communication is frequent, it's easy to take each other for granted, to overlook the depth of the connection, or to misinterpret the true meaning of certain behaviors. But when silence enters, every memory becomes louder. Every meaningful moment resurfaces. The emotional bond, if real, grows stronger because silence acts like an amplifier of what was already there. The mind has time to remember, to reflect, and to recognize the depth of the relationship in a way that constant interaction never allowed. When two people step away from each other, they begin to heal individually. This personal healing becomes the foundation for a stronger reconnection later. Often, arguments, misunderstandings, or emotional pressure can create cycles where both individuals react instead of reflect. Communication becomes defensive, repetitive, or emotionally charged. But silence breaks that cycle. It calms the emotional storm and gives each person the opportunity to come back with a clearer heart and a more stable mindset. In this new emotional space, both sides can see what their role was in the conflict. They become aware of their mistakes, their triggers, and their overlooked needs. The separation becomes an emotional reset that prepares them to reconnect from a place of maturity instead of frustration. During this silence, people also rediscover their identity outside of the relationship. When you spend a lot of time involved with someone, it's easy to lose parts of yourself without realizing it. You may become overly dependent, overly affected, or overly reactive. But in the quiet, you reconnect with yourself, your values, your desires, your ambitions, your strengths. You remember who you were before the noise of the relationship began affecting your thoughts. This personal rediscovery strengthens the connection because you are no longer returning as a weakened version of yourself, but as someone who is emotionally grounded and clear about what you want. A comeback rooted in self-awareness is always stronger than a connection maintained through emotional confusion. Silence also heightens appreciation. When communication stops, the smallest things that once seemed ordinary suddenly become precious. You begin to miss their presence, their voice, their energy, and their support in ways you couldn't recognize when you had regular access to them. This longing isn't a sign of weakness. It's a sign that the bond was meaningful. The heart learns the value of what it is temporarily separated from. And when appreciation grows, efforts become intentional. The desire to reconnect becomes rooted in sincerity rather than habit. The return becomes more powerful because both individuals come back wanting to protect and nurture what they almost lost. Another way silence fuels a strong comeback is through mutual reflection. If both individuals genuinely care, both will feel the weight of the distance. Both will reflect on what went wrong, what went unsaid, and what needs to be changed. This mutual reflection creates emotional alignment. When they finally reconnect, they don't come back to repeat the past. They come back to rebuild the future. The communication becomes more honest, more vulnerable, and more purposeful. The relationship becomes stronger not because they avoided conflict, but because they learned and evolved from it. Silence often filters out temporary emotions and reveals long-term intentions. If the connection was based on impulse, convenience, or superficial attraction, silence will dissolve it. But if the connection was rooted in something deeper, respect, love, emotional resonance, silence strengthens it. The separation becomes a test that both individuals pass not through words, but through emotional resilience. When they come back, it's with deeper understanding, stronger commitment, and renewed energy. The comeback becomes powerful because it is built not on need, but on choice, not on fear, but on clarity, not on habit, but on genuine emotional evolution.